There's an area of northwestern North Carolina in the counties of Wilkes and Allegheny that became home to European immigrants in the 18th century.
Falls off the mountainside.
People were buying land there in the late 1700s, where Stone Mountain State Park is. Not the mountain, Granite Mountain itself. That was purchased in the 1840s by people who wanted the granite. And thankfully, they never got it. And there were a lot more families there than most people realize. Because now when you're walking through the trails, you'll see one or two chimneys along the way, and it's all rural and grown up, and you can't imagine how that was a community.
But a community it was, settled by English, German, French, Irish, and Scottish immigrants who brought with them their particular ways. One of which was the art of making whiskey, also called moonshine or spirits.
It was mainly for the family, the relatives, just local people to use and enjoy.
Back then, making whiskey was legal, as long as you paid your taxes, which most people didn't. By 1902, families started moving out of the area. The rocky soil wasn't the best for farming to produce the food they needed for survival.
The few people that lived there, they might own, and sometimes 30, 50, or 100 acres. You could find a flat spot for a garden on that much land. But as parcels were smaller, there just wasn't a lot of land for farming.
It's rotten rock, really, because of all the volcanic activity around in there.
The timber was probably the most sought after use of that land, at least through the early 1900s.
All the wonderful timber soon caught the attention of those who knew how to profit from it.
The Winston Land and Improvement Company bought thousands of acres along the south edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, including almost all of Stone Mountain State Park. They bought it for the resources. They had that as an infinite amount of timber. So it was logged pretty extensively in the very early 1900s. So trees that I've read were very large, maybe 200 years old, very large trees. You just don't see that at Stone Mountain now because most everything is less than 100 years old. And now it's smaller trees and more undergrowth.
Some families stayed, and when making whiskey became illegal in North Carolina in the early 1900s, the canopy of underbrush and hills made it perfect to hide a still.
You can get in here in these rhododendron thickets and stuff, and you just can't, they're hard to get to.
It was remote, so it was harder for the law or the revenuers to get in.
And during the Depression, the liquor became highly sought after, and so a lot of the big operation stills like we see today became into being and supplied a lot of revenue for local economy.
They would certainly sell to places. I've seen people that I know in the old newspaper articles caught for selling all the way up into Michigan and all the way down to Florida. So that tells you that our product here in this area was sought after near and far.
That says a lot for the whiskey recipe those first settlers brought, because over 100 years later, it remained the same.
Moonshine, it was really called Sugarhead. They had to use sugar and some mash and that sort of thing, and water, and anything that would ferment. I guess they'd put yeast in it and make it ferment. Then they'd boil it down, and the residue that came off was alcoholic.
Everybody here in this area had a still, or most everybody had a still, and they would produce some. It was a nice way to make fast cash, and there wasn't anything else here.
Times were tough, all right, and the production and sale of moonshine provided the thing people needed most to survive.
Food. That's right. They had to feed their families.
A lot of people were in the moonshine business because there wasn't a lot of other work. Their only other income would have been from their own farm. And if they didn't have a lot of land, there wasn't much income to be had.
The veterans came back to Wilkes County after fighting over in Europe, and there wasn't much to do here. They couldn't make a living. They were very law-abiding people, being through the military, but they couldn't make a living. So they decided, let's do a little moonshine.
A lot of these stills made money for the local community and local area people. A lot of these people that made moonshine sometimes had what they call a sugar daddy that supplied them with the materials and so forth. If they got caught, the sugar daddy would look after the family while they went to prison. And then a lot of times when the individual got out of prison, they supplied them back with the goods to go back into operations. So,
Whenever I started driving a school bus, the driver got fired because he would pick up the children, take them to school, stay there all day, and then he could take them all home. He'd disconnect the governors on the school bus and haul moonshine in the school bus at night.
People knew how important moonshine was to the livelihood of some families. So much so, their secret was often safe.
If you were friendly enough with your neighbors, they wouldn't report you. But at the same time, I don't want it on my land because then I'm partly responsible for it.
there's one place in the park where the Hicks family, and there's a chimney there, and there's creeks in that area, and we've searched all those creeks, and we've never found a still on any of those creeks. And the word was that the family said, we're not against you making moonshine, but we don't ever want to find a still on our property.
And I think Wilkes County in the 50s sort of, there was a wink and a nod. They didn't really go after them a lot here, mainly because it's sparsely populated, and you're probably related to your uncle or your great uncle, and he's the one up the hill.
My grandfather was an attorney in Wilkesboro and mayor of the town, and people knew that. And my father moved there, and they thought he was a plant to tell about the moonshine. And people just were kind of standoffish when they had got to, see which way the wind was blowing. He called the school board and he said, now, gentlemen, and two of them were moonshiners. He says, now, gentlemen, I know what you do for a living out here. I came in here to teach school. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone, and we'll get along.
In most cases, getting caught and sentenced was even far different than you might expect.
They would run from the law, but if the revenue would touch them, they would just, I'm caught, I'm done. You don't need to put cuffs on me or whatever. Most of them are not aggressive type folks.
And in fact, if you were caught making moonshine, you were generally, the first offense was 1 year and 1 day in North Carolina. And they did that because North Carolina law says that if you have a sentence of a year, you have to serve it. But if it's over a year, you can get out for good behavior. So they were in for 2 weeks and then back out.
And of course, they would come back home and, it'd be just like a college group getting together. And they'd talk about the guards up there, the wardens and everything like that, and laugh about them and everything. And it was just a home week.
Getting caught was worth the risk, though, and why most would go right back to making spirits when they were released.
Now, we talked to revenuers and we talked to moonshiners, and one of the moonshiners said that they could make anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000 a week running liquor here. And some of the big stills, they're producing well over 1,000 gallons a week. So it was a big operation, and they didn't use things like mason jars because mason jars broke. They transported it in 5-gallon jerry cans. And there's some sites that we found, we call them ambush sites, where maybe they were transporting the liquor out, and the moonshiners grabbed them, and you'll see the ground just littered with 5-gallon jerry cans. All of them hit with an axe, so they can't be used later on.
One thing that made it easier for revenuers to find stills was the amount of smoke those that were heated by wood or coal produced.
Some of the people said that you could come up the road, all you saw was just a mist of coal smoke.
But now, after they got to having more problems with the revenuers busting their stills, they started using coke.
which was smokeless.
This byproduct of coal, called coke, wasn't enough to help, and by the 1960s, the industry was on the way out.
The revenuers got an airplane.
And look for smoke coming up in the early mornings because they probably both cooked mostly at night where they couldn't be found.
And they also got radios. There also were more economic opportunities here in Wilkes County.
As cities started developing more and businesses started coming, there were other options for working in the city, working in a factory or at some other business.
When Holly Farms moved into the county, it kind of gave a lot of people a law-abiding job with a good income.
The moonshiners had moved on, but what was left of their many stills remained.
We have found close to 200, and we've heard, what, 250 maybe or so in the park. But yeah, there's a lot of stills.
Over a half-century later, all that remains of these stills are deteriorating pieces of history, time capsules of the moonshine industry here, starting with what is left of the earliest stills.
Where they had a rock furnace basically built, and they fed wood that they could get anywhere around here to heat it up. Those were very small stills. They might produce a gallon or two, and most of that was for their own use. Those are the very old ones.
Some of the old wooden barrel rings where the barrels have disintegrated, but we find some of the old rings that held the mash and some of the product.
Next were two-barrel stills.
And what we call stacker stills, which are 55-gallon drums welded together on top of each other, usually two drums with two or three of these stacked side by side.
They could produce maybe 50 gallons, maybe 40, 50 gallons in a week.
The largest stills were called submarine stills for obvious reasons.
Measure about 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. So that's roughly 1,000 gallons.
Sometimes probably in the 40s, 50s, they came into being. A lot of people came back from World War II with a lot of welding skills, and you had to make these type of things, so they came into operation. These are your big commercial type stills. This submarine still used propane or gas to fire it up.
And in the park, we found as many as 8 submarine stills in one site.
They're either blown up by dynamite or axed. So some of these outfits in the mountains were very large and would have been very expensive, especially if they were lost because they were ratted out by their neighbors or the revenuers somehow, some other way got word of where they were.
The moonshiners of Stone Mountain are long gone, but their legacy remains beyond the rusted metal they left behind.
It's interesting history, and you see how people lived back when things were tight. People will survive one way or the other.
The moonshiners also gave back a lot to the community.
They were your local people that lived up here. Some of them had family all around. They went to church.
They took care of each other. If one of them went to jail, somebody took care of the kids. There wasn't welfare as we know it here.
Their lives are part of the fabric of our state and why it's important to tell their tale for generations to come.
It's going to be hard to preserve them. I mean, as you can see, they're deteriorating now. Perhaps the way you preserve it is through these films, showing what it was like. I think it's always important for us to know our own history.
In addition to the stills, there are lots of old home sites that you find in the park. Some of them, the chimneys are still standing, some of them are down. Several old grave sites. There's some interesting history in some of the graves. it's just interesting to see what you're going to find and how many people actually live and settle this area. It's just amazing to me.
In 1969, the over 14,000-acre community of Stone Mountain became a state park. Today, one way to experience the history of the moonshine stills is by walking the same land its residents did by way of the many trails available now.
If you do choose to come out and go off trail, make sure you've got somebody with you, make sure you know what you're doing. If you get lost, walk downstream. Just follow the stream down and you're gonna hit a road.
Know where you're going, have a good GPS or a good map of the park and know where you are, because you can get lost in this park or go over the wrong ridge and just go totally the wrong way. So, and go with somebody, have somebody with you when you go in case something happens, but just go out and have fun.
I